The tablecloth was a soft, innocent cream color, the kind people choose when they want a dinner to feel warm and welcoming, but all I could see was how badly it would stain if I spilled something. My hands were already trembling slightly as I folded my napkin on my lap for the third time. The dining room lights were too bright, reflecting off polished silverware and crystal glasses, making everything feel exposed. I remember thinking very clearly that this room did not belong to me, even though I was sitting right in the middle of it. The smell of roasted meat and rosemary hung in the air, rich and heavy, and beneath it was something sharper, like metal. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe it was the feeling that something was about to break. Across the table, my mother-in-law smiled at me, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Her lipstick was perfectly applied, not a smudge out of place, and she lifted her wine glass just slightly, as if to toast the room rather than any person in it. My father-in-law cleared his throat beside her, a small, practiced sound that made everyone sit a little straighter. My husband, Daniel, squeezed my knee under the table. It was meant to be reassuring. Instead, it felt like a warning. That was the night I learned how quietly people can hurt you while pretending to do nothing at all. If you had met me a year earlier, you might have described me as confident. Not loud or flashy, but steady. I was the kind of person who showed up on time, remembered birthdays, and listened more than she spoke. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm, a job that demanded organization and calm under pressure. I was good at it. I had built a life I was proud of, piece by piece, without shortcuts. When I married Daniel, I believed I was marrying into a family that valued the same things: effort, respect, and quiet dignity. Daniel and I met in our late 20s. We were both past the phase of dramatic love stories and reckless decisions. Our relationship grew slowly, rooted in shared routines and long conversations over cheap takeout. He was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply loyal, or so I believed. When he talked about his parents, he did so with a kind of reverence that made me both admire and fear them before I ever met them. They were successful, well-connected, and very particular about appearances. The first time I went to their house, I wore a navy blue dress that I had carefully chosen for its simplicity. Nothing too trendy, nothing too bold. My mother-in-law, Patricia, looked me up and down with a quick, practiced glance and said, "Oh, you dress very modestly." She smiled afterward, as if she had paid me a compliment. I laughed it off then. I was eager to be liked. I wanted to fit into the picture they already had of their family, even if I wasn't sure where I belonged in it yet. Small comments like that became a pattern. Never outright insults. Never anything I could point to and say, "This is cruelty." It was always just enough to make me second-guess myself. Just enough to make me feel like I was constantly being evaluated. When Daniel proposed, I told myself it would get better once I was officially part of the family. I believed commitment would soften their edges. I was wrong. The family dinner that night was meant to celebrate Daniel's promotion. A bigger role, more responsibility, a significant pay increase. Patricia had insisted on hosting, saying it was important to mark milestones properly. I offered to help cook. She declined. I suggested bringing dessert. She smiled and said she already had something special planned. So I showed up with flowers and a carefully wrapped bottle of wine, feeling like a guest in a space that was supposed to welcome me as family. As we sat at the table, the conversation flowed easily at first. Work updates, polite laughter, stories from Daniel's childhood that I had heard before but listened to again with a smile. I tried to relax. I told myself I was imagining the tension in my shoulders, the way my stomach felt tight despite how hungry I was. Then Patricia leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and looked directly at me. "So," she said, her voice light, almost playful, "how is work going for you these days?" I hesitated for half a second, sensing something beneath the question. "It's going well," I said. "Busy but good. We just wrapped up a big project last week." She nodded slowly. "Project coordinator, right?" She glanced at her husband. "That's sort of like an assistant role, isn't it?" The word assistant hung in the air. My father-in-law chuckled softly. "Everyone starts somewhere," he said. Daniel shifted beside me but said nothing. I felt my face grow warm. "It's more about managing timelines and communication between teams," I said carefully. "It's a lot of responsibility." Patricia tilted her head. "Of course. I just worry sometimes. Daniel's career is really taking off. You know how demanding these positions can be. I hope you'll still have time to keep things running smoothly at home." There it was. Not an insult. A concern. Wrapped in care. Delivered with a smile. I glanced at Daniel, waiting for him to step in, to say something, anything. He smiled awkwardly and took a sip of his wine. "We manage," he said vaguely. The rest of the dinner unfolded like that. Comment after comment, each one small enough to seem harmless on its own. Patricia remarked on how lucky I was to have married into such a stable family. She asked if I planned to stay in my role once we had children, as if it were already assumed that my ambitions would shrink to fit someone else's expectations. My father-in-law commented on the cost of living, mentioning how difficult it must be for people without substantial savings to keep up. At one point, Patricia laughed and said, "I remember when Daniel dated that lawyer. Such a driven girl. Very impressive." She looked at me afterward, eyes bright, waiting. I smiled because that's what I had trained myself to do. Smile and swallow and tell myself I was being too sensitive. But something shifted inside me when the main course was served. Plates were passed around, and Patricia placed mine down in front of me with a little too much force. "Careful," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is real china. Not the kind you find just anywhere." I froze. My fork hovered over the plate. I felt suddenly very small, like a child being scolded in front of adults. I looked down at the delicate... I didn't sleep much that night. Daniel fell asleep quickly, the way people do when they believe an argument is temporary, something that will smooth itself out by morning. I lay awake listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady and unbothered, while my mind replayed every word from the dinner. Not just the last one, but all of them, stacked together like small stones pressing on my chest. For the first time since we'd married, I wondered what my life would look like if I stopped trying so hard to be acceptable to people who had already decided I wasn't enough. The next morning, Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work and said, "We'll talk later," in a tone that suggested the issue was already shrinking in importance. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee, watching him walk out the door, and realized something uncomfortable. For him, conflict with his parents was temporary and inconvenient. For me, it was permanent and personal. Days passed. Then weeks. We saw his parents less often, but when we did, nothing had changed. Patricia was polite now, overly so, which somehow felt worse. The comments didn't stop, they just became quieter, more careful. She asked questions that sounded supportive, but carried the same sharp edge. My father-in-law remained distant, offering brief nods and neutral conversation, as if I had disappointed him by speaking up. I started pulling away without meaning to. At work, I stayed later. I volunteered for projects that required travel. I told myself I was being ambitious, but deep down, I knew I was avoiding home. Avoiding the silence that settled between Daniel and me whenever his family came up. Avoiding the feeling that I was slowly becoming a problem to manage rather than a partner to protect. One evening, Daniel mentioned that his parents were hosting a large family gathering. An anniversary dinner. "They really want us there," he said, trying to sound casual. My stomach tightened. "Do they want me there?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "They want us," he repeated. That pause told me everything. I agreed to go anyway. Part of me still hoped that if I showed up enough times, if I proved myself patient and respectful, something would shift. Another part of me wanted clarity, even if it hurt. The house was full that night. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people I barely knew but who clearly knew of me. The air buzzed with laughter and overlapping conversations. I smiled, greeted everyone politely, accepted hugs that felt stiff and unfamiliar. Patricia moved through the room like a conductor, orchestrating the evening with effortless authority. When she saw me, she kissed my cheek lightly and said, "I'm glad you could make it," in a tone that suggested she had not been sure. Dinner was served buffet style. As people filled their plates, conversations turned louder, looser. Wine flowed freely. I found myself sitting next to Daniel, across from Patricia and my father-in-law. At first, the talk was harmless. Stories from the past, jokes I didn't fully understand but laughed at anyway. Then one of Daniel's cousins leaned forward and said, "So, when are you two thinking about kids?" The question hit like a sudden gust of cold air. Daniel glanced at me. I felt Patricia's eyes on my face. "We haven't decided yet," I said carefully. Patricia smiled. "Daniel was such an easy baby," she said, ignoring me. "I always say good parenting shows early." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. "Parenting is a shared effort," I said. "And every child is different." She looked at me, eyebrows raised slightly. "Of course. But some people are just naturally better suited for it." There it was again. That quiet implication. The room felt suddenly too loud, too crowded. I could feel heat rising in my face. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom! She waved a hand. I'm just saying it's important to think about these things. Children need stability. Strong values. I looked around the table. Some people avoided my gaze. Others watched with open curiosity, as if this were entertainment. I realized then that this wasn't just between Patricia and me anymore. This was a performance. And I was losing. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I stared at my reflection, at the woman who looked composed on the outside and fractured on the inside. I pressed my palms against the counter and took a deep breath. I told myself I was allowed to exist. I was allowed to take up space. I was allowed to be respected. When I returned, Daniel followed me into the hallway. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low. No, I said. And I need you to stop pretending this is normal. He sighed, rubbing his temples. What do you want me to do? They're my parents. I want you to stand up for me, I said. Not later. Not in private. In the moment. He looked away. You know how they are. That sentence landed harder than any insult. Because it meant he had already accepted it. And by accepting it, he was asking me to do the same. We stayed for another hour out of obligation. I barely spoke. On the drive home, the silence was heavy and brittle. A few days later, Patricia called me directly. That alone felt unusual. Her voice was sweet, almost apologetic. She said she wanted to clear the air, that perhaps things had gotten misunderstood. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us. I considered saying no. I should have said no. But I went. We met at a quiet restaurant, elegant but understated. Patricia arrived early, already seated with a glass of water. She smiled when she saw me, gesturing for me to sit. I'm glad you came, she said. I've been thinking a lot. So have I replied. She clasped her hands together. I feel like there's tension between us, and I hate that. Family should be harmonious. I nodded slowly. I agree. She leaned forward. I want you to understand that everything I say comes from concern. Daniel is very important to us. We just want to make sure he's supported. I support him, I said. Every day. She smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. Support can look different to different people. I felt a familiar frustration rise. Patricia, I said, choosing my words carefully, when you make comments about my career, my body, or my ability to be a good parent, it hurts. It makes me feel unwelcome. She tilted her head. Oh dear, you're taking it far too personally. There it was. The dismissal. The implication that my feelings were the problem. I'm telling you how I feel, I said. And I'm telling you, she replied calmly, that intention matters more than perception. I would never intentionally hurt you. But you are hurting me, I said, my voice shaking slightly. She sighed as if burdened. You're very sensitive. Daniel warned me about that. That sentence took the air out of my lungs. Daniel said that? I asked quietly. She paused, then smiled. Well, not in those exact words. But he worries about how easily you're affected. I sat back, stunned. I realized in that moment that this conversation was never meant to heal anything. It was meant to put me back in my place. To remind me that in their version of the family, I was an outsider who needed correction. I think we're done here, I said, standing up. She looked genuinely surprised. Already? Yes, I said. I don't think this is productive. I left without waiting for her response. That night, Daniel and I had the hardest conversation of our marriage. I told him about the lunch, about what his mother had said. He denied it at first, then admitted he might have mentioned that I was emotional during an argument. I was venting, he said. It didn't mean anything. It meant something to her, I said. And it means something to me. We went in circles. He asked me to be patient. I asked him to be present. He said I was asking him to choose. I told him he already had. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought something was wrong with me, but because I needed clarity. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining things. And she did. What you're describing is emotional invalidation, she said gently. And it's damaging over time. I began setting small boundaries, declining invitations, leaving gatherings early, correcting comments calmly instead of smiling through them. Each boundary was met with subtle resistance. Patricia acted wounded. My father-in-law grew colder. Daniel grew quieter. Then came the final dinner, the one that would change everything. It was Daniel's birthday. Patricia insisted on hosting. I told Daniel I didn't want to go. He begged. He said it would mean a lot to him. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The evening started pleasantly. Cake, laughter, gifts. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. Then Patricia raised her glass. I just want to say how proud we are of Daniel, she said. He's accomplished so much despite the challenges. She paused, letting the word hang. Not everyone is equipped to walk beside someone like him, she continued. But family endures. Family adapts. I felt my heart pounding. I knew what was coming. She turned to me. Marriage requires sacrifice, she said softly. Some people struggle with that. The room went silent. I stood up. I won't be spoken about like this, I said, my voice clear and steady. Not here. Not anywhere. Patricia's face hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, I said. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Daniel stood too, panic flashing across his face. Please, he said. Not tonight. This is exactly the night, I replied. I looked around the room, at the faces watching us. I have tried to be respectful. I have tried to belong. But respect goes both ways. And I'm tired of being humiliated under the guise of concern. No one spoke. I turned to Daniel. If you stay silent now, you're choosing. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause felt endless. I can't do this, he said finally. Not like this. Something in me broke, and something else finally healed. I understand, I said. I picked up my coat and walked out. That was the last family dinner I ever attended. The months that followed were painful, but clarifying. Daniel and I separated quietly. No shouting. No drama. Just the slow acknowledgement that love without protection is not enough. I moved into a small apartment. I filled it with light and quiet. I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I ran into Patricia once months later at a grocery store. She looked startled to see me. Older somehow. I hope you're well, she said stiffly. I am, I replied. And for the first time it was true. Humiliation taught me something I never wanted to learn. That silence can be as cruel as words, and that dignity sometimes requires walking away from the table, even when you're hungry. If you've ever felt small in a room where you were supposed to belong, know this. You don't have to earn basic respect. And leaving is not losing. Sometimes it's the bravest form of self-respect there is. Wondered how something so beautiful could make me feel so ashamed. I think we should toast, my father-in-law said, raising his glass. To Daniel. And to the family that supports him. Everyone lifted their glasses. I did too, a fraction of a second late. Patricia's eyes flicked to mine, and for just a moment her smile faltered. Then she leaned toward me and said quietly, You know, dear, being part of this family comes with certain expectations. We all have to carry our weight. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what she meant, not fully. But I nodded because nodding was easier than asking her to explain. By the time dessert arrived, my appetite was gone. Patricia had made a beautiful tart, golden and glossy, and everyone praised it lavishly. She accepted the compliments with practiced humility. When she served me my slice, she paused. Are you watching your figure? She asked, her voice dripping with concern. I can give you a smaller piece if you'd like. The table went quiet for a second. I forced a laugh. This is fine, I said. Daniel finally spoke up. Mom, that's enough. She looked genuinely surprised. Enough of what? She asked. I'm just trying to be helpful. The silence that followed was heavy. My father-in-law cleared his throat again. Daniel stared at his plate. I wished, desperately, that I could disappear. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past the windows, streaks of yellow and white against the dark. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. I waited, hoping he would say something, acknowledge what had happened. When he didn't, I spoke. Did you notice tonight how your mother was talking to me? He sighed. She didn't mean anything by it. That's not an answer, I said quietly. She's just old-fashioned, he replied. She worries. That's how she shows it. I turned to look at him. She humiliated me, Daniel. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. You're reading too much into it. She likes you. She just has high standards. High standards. The phrase echoed in my head long after we got home and went to bed, lying side by side in the dark with a careful distance between us. I stared at the ceiling and felt something crack, slowly, silently. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was about every moment like it, every time I had made myself smaller to fit into a space that refused to expand for me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to let it go. I told myself that marriage required compromise, patience, understanding. But the memory of that dinner clung to me. The way Patricia's words had landed, the way Daniel had looked away. I began to notice things I had previously ignored. How family gatherings always seemed to revolve around their achievements, their opinions. How my contributions were acknowledged only when they aligned with what they already valued. Then came the invitation to another dinner. A smaller one, Patricia said. Just immediate family. I hesitated before agreeing, but Daniel assured me it would be different. I wanted to believe him. That night, as I got dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired. Older somehow. I chose a simple sweater and slacks, safe and unremarkable. As we drove over, my chest felt tight. I told myself it was just nerves. The evening started pleasantly enough. But midway through, Patricia brought up finances. She spoke about investments, property values, the importance of smart decisions. Then she turned to me. Have you ever thought about taking some courses? She asked. Something more substantial? It could be good for you. I stared at her. I'm happy with my career, I said. She smiled gently. Of course you are. But happiness isn't everything. Security matters. Especially when you're married to someone with potential. Something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I set my fork down. Are you implying that I'm a risk to your son's future? Her smile faded. I'm just saying we all want what's best for Daniel. So do I said. My voice was steady, surprising even me. Daniel looked between us, panic flickering across his face. Can we not do this right now? He asked. Patricia leaned back, arms crossed. I didn't realize honest conversation was so offensive. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I stood anyway. I don't feel welcome here, I said. And I'm tired of pretending I do. The room went silent. My father-in-law stared at me, as if I had broken some unspoken rule. Daniel reached for my hand, but I pulled away. We're leaving, I said. The drive home was tense, filled with words that spilled out after being held in too long. Daniel accused me of overreacting. I told him I felt alone. He said his parents would never change. I asked him if that meant I had to. That night marked the beginning of a distance between us that could not be ignored. I began to understand that humiliation doesn't always come from shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it comes from being quietly dismissed, over and over, until you start to question your own worth. I didn't know it then, but that family dinner was only the beginning. What came next would force me to make a choice I had been avoiding for far too long. And once I made it, there would be no going back.